to the results of this year's election, the weekend's election, I should say. It feels like a year, I'm sure, and for our next guest, I'm sure that weekend felt like a year as well. That is the independent MP for Wentworth, Allegra Spender, who has been re-elected in that seat of Wentworth as an independent, indeed with a swing to her. Allegra, thanks so much for your time. Congratulations. What do you put the win down to?
Look, I think the community really came behind me and, volunteers were out. It was a really, again, a very strong community-led campaign. And I honestly think that the Liberals ran an incredibly negative campaign here, but didn't have any policies or any commitment to the values or the lessons of the last election. The last election they lost in this seat because they weren't serious about climate action, they weren't serious about women, and they didn't have a strong economic approach. And similarly, I think they were really punished again this time because these are the values of our community. We are a very moderate community. We don't like culture wars. We focus on business. We care about the environment, and the Liberals just were not representing the values of this community.
Well, you talk about climate and women, but was that really what this election campaign was about in Wentworth? Because this around the country was very much a cost of living election. Was that different there in Wentworth?
Look, I think the cost of living was really critical as well, but climate and women do matter as part of this. I would say that on the cost of living point, there was no credible economic plan from the Liberal Party. And, I had so many people actually come up to me on the booth and say, thank you for tackling the hard issues. Thank you for putting tax reform on the agenda, for the work you're doing on this, for championing, the removal of bracket creep by indexing tax thresholds. Yeah. That was the sort of thing that a lot of people said thank you for, and that was a lack of leadership, I think, from the Liberal Party on the economy as well. But it was on top of a lack, sort of coming back to the culture wars and a lack of seriousness in relation to climate policy.
What are you talking about in the culture wars in particular? You're talking about Welcome to Country. Obviously, in your seat of Wentworth, there is a bigger Jewish population than some of the other seats around the rest of the country. The Liberal Party was seen as really strong on wanting to clamp down on anti-Semitism. Is that what you're talking about?
No, I'm not. I'm not talking about anti-Semitism, which is a really serious issue and has been a serious issue in this community. I'm talking more about things like going after Welcome to Country and real concern from the LGBTQ community, who is a very important part of Wentworth as well. Concern about, sort of Liberal Party in some cases backing people like Pauline Hanson's push, to do a trans kids inquiry in the Senate, which I cannot imagine a worse place to do anything like that. So I think it's that sort of, those were kind of, I think, the aspects of the culture wars. But the sense of really, going after also women working from home. Again, I think Wentworth has the biggest proportion of people working from home in the country, certainly did over the pandemic, and has the biggest proportion of professional women who use working from home as part of their way of balancing, their various responsibilities. Yeah. So those are the aspects I think were really problematic.
Okay, but Allegra, you and I both know that was only ever about the public service, but why were women in Wentworth so concerned about if it was only the public service?
I think it just showed that the coalition was out of touch with women and still didn't run women. I mean, in the seats that they held before the last election, they ran 20% women. 1 in 5 candidates are women for the seats that they were currently holding. I mean, it's, you wouldn't get away with that if you were a company, and you shouldn't be able to get away with that as in Parliament. And now I think we're going to see less than that, or fewer than that, in the actual Parliament. And again, that goes to who is the Liberal Party trying to represent here? Because this community, as I said, has some of the highest number of professional women in the country.
I just want to have a little look, drill down a little bit on the primary vote in Wentworth, because I'm just looking at it now. 36,200 votes. Roanoke's the Liberal candidate, 36,600 votes. So she had just a few hundred more primary votes than you in the outcome there. But obviously a big vote for Labor and the Greens, and that high Liberal vote has got you there in the end. How do you see that? How do you interpret that message that you get from the electorate?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because interesting that the Liberal Party really went down in terms of their primary vote in this election. So Dave Sharma in the previous election had a very big lead for me. Oh, not a huge lead, but I think a 4 percentage point. We still haven't counted all the votes, so I'm not quite sure where it will end up. But I think that what it showed is that Malcolm Turnbull won the seat, I think, on like 62% or even in more than that. To see the Liberal Party where they are now shows how many of those Liberal Party people who used to vote for a moderate like Malcolm Turnbull, where they've moved. And I think that's it's that sense that the Liberal Party has been now dominated by the National Party in their agenda on nuclear, on on things like the voice, on issues like divestment of supermarkets, issues that which aren't normally typically Liberal Party issues. I think that really distracted people, and that's why you're seeing the Liberal Party getting 43% two-party preferred compared to when Malcolm Turnbull was here, he got 62. Yeah. So I think that's really the big shift that you're seeing.
Well, so what do you think this is? That Liberals, but is it particularly women in Wentworth that see you as the more palatable alternative? And do you classify yourself as a centre-right candidate?
Look, I see myself as a small L Liberal, and I see myself as, I'm economically, conservative. I've run businesses. I'm very focused on the business community, but I'm also socially liberal. I don't, and I'm also care about the environment. And so I would describe myself as a small L Liberal, which I think is pretty consistent, with a big part of the community around here.
Okay, just on climate, because again, this was a cost of living election. It wasn't a climate election like 2022. I'm not saying the people of Wentworth still don't want action on climate change, but going into this parliament now, we see Labor with a huge majority, a huge mandate as well. Their risk here is hubris and overreach. What is your role? I mean, I know you don't hold the balance of power in the House of Reps, but, I think a strong government is buoyed by a strong opposition. And I would say, because the crossbench is so large, that also applies to independents like yourself. So what do you say to already the Labor left, who's saying that there should be increased targets on emissions reduction by 2030? Do you urge caution there in noting that there is still a big problem around the cost of energy?
So I think, so more broadly, with the coalition, so reduced and in such disarray, I think you're absolutely right that the crossbench will be a really important part of holding the government to account while still being a constructive partner across the parliament. And then in relation to climate in particular, I think it all comes down to what can be achieved. I would love to see us exceed 43% reduction in emissions by 2030, but we need to do this in a way that is achievable and also makes economic sense. And so this is where I think the government, I will be pushing the government to be looking at areas such as putting forward reforms for the EPBC Act, because currently they are slowing our transition. They are making it much more expensive to do business more broadly, and they are hurting our environment because we have poor environmental laws. So I want to see us go further and faster, but it also, we have to do this in a practical way. And again, I'll be looking for the Climate Change Authority's advice on this in terms of how do they see that we can do this in a way that is affordable. Because you're right that cost matters. We have to do this in an affordable way. And that means, how do we make this transition cheaper? And I think that is where things like the EPBC Act is really important. It's also where things like tax reform is important.
Just one final question. Whilst you've increased your two-party preferred vote, when you look to Melbourne, your colleague Zoe Daniel has lost her seat of Goldstein, and Monique Ryan could lose the seat of Kooyong. Why do you think that is? What's the difference between their loss and your win?
Look, I mean, these two seats are still pretty much in play, as I understand. But
Goldstein's not. Yeah, I think Goldstein's
they're still counting. Yeah, I think they're still counting, but we'll see. I think the media has called it various ways, but we will see what happens in the end. Look, I think, it's very hard to tell. Every seat is really different. I think they had, significant redistributions. I'm not sure how that affected those seats. And let's remember that these are seats that have never been held by non-Liberals before. these are seats that had never been held by women before. So it was always going to be tough. They always had, both of them had smaller margins than mine going into the election, and so we'll just have to see. I think when it comes to this, you're seeing a lot of seats that are really tightly in play at the moment, and I think that really comes down to lots of local factors.
Allegra, thanks so much for your time. Appreciate it. Let's do it again soon.
Thanks so much, Laura.